The rain came down soft over Midtown Manhattan, the kind that didn't commit to anything, not a storm, not a drizzle. Just a gray presence that clung to awnings and turned the sidewalks into mirrors, the kind of rain that makes a city feel like it is holding its breath. Aurelius, the restaurant at 54th and Park, was the sort of place where the lighting cost more than most people's rent. Copper pendants hung at calibrated intervals above linen-covered tables. The wine list came bound in leather, the pages thick enough to feel substantial between your fingers. Pale roses sat in short-necked vases, one per table, changed daily, never more than 3 blooms. The menu was 4 pages, but the words on it were sparse. When you have to explain what something is, the thinking goes, it means the thing isn't good enough yet. The waitstaff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained to be invisible until the exact moment they were needed. They materialized at your shoulder. They vanished before you had registered they were there. Daniel Whitfield stood at the entrance and held his daughter's hand. He was 38, with the kind of face that had lived through things without advertising them, sharp jaw. A few gray threads at his temples that he'd stopped noticing 2 years ago. He wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, no tie, clean, presentable. The blazer was good quality, the kind that stays good after years because it was made to. Decidedly not the room, but not unaware of that fact. He'd taken the subway from Brooklyn, the 4 train uptown, standing room, holding the overhead bar with one hand and Lily's hand with the other. She'd spent the ride with her nose in her book, leaning slightly into his arm without thinking about it. Lily was 10 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's silence. She wore a navy dress she'd picked herself. She'd been very specific about the collar, which had to be plain, and she carried a small hardcover book, a field guide to North American birds, tucked under her arm like a badge. She observed everything. She always had, from the time she was small enough that adults thought she wasn't listening. She was always listening. She was always watching. She had her father's talent for being quiet in a way that collected information. The maitre d' looked at Daniel, the way people look at someone who has walked into the wrong room, but hasn't realized it yet. The look lasted less than a second. These were professional people. They didn't let things show. Reservation, the word came out clipped. Whitfield. I'm meeting a party already seated. Daniel's voice was even. No apology in it. No aggression. Just the simple architecture of a fact. The maitre d' checked the list with the deliberate slowness of someone exercising the only power they had. His eyes moved down the page. Then something shifted in his expression, not warmth, but a recalibration. The name was on the list. The table it corresponded to was not the sort of table you left people waiting at. He led them through the restaurant. They passed tables of men in suits and women in things that cost a season's salary. The conversations were low and purposeful. The laughter measured and infrequent. A few heads turned as Daniel and Lily made their way toward the back, the man in the serviceable blazer and the girl with the bird book. Daniel didn't notice, or didn't care. It was hard to tell with him, sometimes, which of those two things it was. Lily noticed everything and said nothing. At the far end of the room, in a corner table that faced the entire floor and gave sightlines to both exits, sat Victoria Hayes. She was 36 and looked like she'd never wasted a minute of it. Dark hair pulled back with architectural precision. A cream blouse that probably had a name, if you knew where to look. The kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym, it comes from years of being the only woman in a room full of men who wanted her to take up less space, and deciding very deliberately to do the opposite. She had built stratum capital from a single office in a rented floor of a Chicago high-rise to a fund that touched 4 continents and managed capital in the low billions. She had done this by being smarter than the room, consistently, and by never confusing the appearance of a deal with the substance of one. She did not suffer fools. She did not suffer delays. She was, by the assessment of people who had negotiated against her. Beside her sat her translator, a man named Gregory Marsh, late 40s, steel-rimmed glasses. A navy suit that was slightly too formal for the room. He sat very straight, which some people would read as good posture, and some people would read as a man making a sustained effort. His hands rested on the table in a way that was almost calculated. as if stillness were something he was performing, rather than something he simply was. A notepad beside his right hand, a pen, uncapped and ready, and across from Victoria's empty chairs, a briefcase already placed beside his leg, sat a third man, Marcus, Victoria's associate, early 30s, the particular tired energy of someone who is very good at their job and knows it, and is slightly afraid that knowing it will be enough to make them stop working as hard. He was reviewing something on a tablet, his expression professionally blank. Daniel and Lily reached the table. Victoria looked up. The briefest flicker of something reassessment crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth, measured attention she gave to everything that mattered. Mr. Whitfield, she did not stand. I'm glad you could make it. Miss Hayes. Daniel pulled out the chair beside him for Lily, then sat. Thank you for accommodating my situation. The word situation did a quiet amount of work in that sentence. It named the fact of Lily without explaining or apologizing for it. Victoria's eyes moved to Lily for exactly 2 seconds, not unkind, not particularly warm. Measuring. Lily met her gaze without flinching and opened her bird book to a page in the middle, a spread showing various species of flycatcher, and began to read. Shall we order first, Victoria said, or go straight to the matter? However you prefer. She gestured to Gregory Marsh. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting his position, and began to speak first in English, summarizing the evening's agenda for Daniel's benefit, laying out the structure of the discussion in a tone that was professionally neutral and faintly condescending in the way that expertise, when it is being performed rather than applied, tends to be. Then he pivoted smoothly into Mandarin for Victoria, who had learned the language well enough to conduct business and follow contracts, but preferred the precision of a trained intermediary for discussions where exact terms mattered. The deal on the table was, on paper, straightforward. A licensing arrangement for a logistics software platform that Daniel's former firm had developed over 3 years. The platform handled supply chain coordination at scale. Nothing flashy, deeply useful, the kind of infrastructure technology that doesn't get written about, but underpins a significant amount of how physical goods move across distances. The rights had passed to Daniel as part of a severance and settlement agreement 2 years ago, when the firm had restructured and he'd needed to leave quickly. He'd negotiated carefully and gotten what he needed. Victoria's fund wanted to acquire those rights and fold the technology into a Southeast Asian infrastructure project. At completion, the project was worth somewhere north of $40 million. Daniel's cut, if negotiations went well, was structured as a combination of upfront payment and ongoing royalties that would, over 5 years, set Lily up through college and then some. It would also give him something to do again, something that used the particular combination of skills he'd spent a decade building and then spent 2 years trying to figure out what to do with. That was the visible shape of the evening. But shapes can lie. A server appeared at Daniel's shoulder, a young woman, mid-20s, with dark blonde hair pinned back, and the alert economy of movement that meant she had been doing this long enough to be genuinely good at it. Her name tag read, Emma. She had a small scar near her left eyebrow that she'd stopped noticing years ago. She carried her notepad the way people carry things they've carried so many times. The object has become an extension of the hand. She set down water glasses with precision and met no one's eyes directly. Table service at this level is partly about making people feel attended to without feeling observed. But in the brief geometry of the table, the positions, the body language, the particular and faint tension in Gregory Marsh's jaw when she arrived near his side, something registered in her attention, not consciously yet. Just a reading. The way a city person learns to read a street without thinking about it. She took their orders. She left. Lily turned a page of her book. The first course arrived as small, perfect thing on a white plate. Some arrangement of cured fish and pickled vegetables that the kitchen had spent considerable thought on. Nobody at the table cared about it. Gregory Marsh was speaking now, relaying Victoria's opening position to Daniel in English. His voice was smooth, professional. There was a gentle authority to it, the authority of a man who controls information flow, which is its own kind of power. There was nothing overtly wrong with anything he said, but the phrasing was slightly off. Not enough that you'd catch it if you weren't listening for it. Not enough that you could point to it and say, there, that word, that construction. It was more the overall direction of things. The way light shifts when you move 2 steps to the left, and suddenly a painting looks like something else entirely. The same shapes, the same materials, a different picture. Victoria spoke in Mandarin. A clear, direct statement about the licensing structure the fund preferred, a split revenue model with a buyout clause at year 3, at market rate, capped at 15% above the acquisition price. The clause protected Daniel's long-term interest and reflected her fund's standard practice for IP deals with individual holders. It was, within the context of this kind of negotiation, a reasonable and even somewhat generous opening. Gregory turned to Daniel. Miss Hayes says the fund is open to discussing a tiered structure, but they'll need full transfer of all subsidiary IP rights before any revenue sharing begins. Daniel nodded slowly. He picked up his water glass. He took a sip. The difference between what Victoria had said and what Gregory had relayed was not the difference between 2 ways of expressing the same idea. It was the difference between a door that opens and a door that is sealed. A full IP transfer at closing would mean Daniel giving away everything before a single dollar changed hands. What Victoria had actually proposed was a phased arrangement, the rights remaining his until a predetermined threshold was reached. One position protected him. One left him with nothing to negotiate from. Lily looked up from her book. She was not watching Gregory. She was watching her father's hand. The way his fingers had tightened, very slightly, around the glass, the knuckles pale for just a second before relaxing. She put her book face down on the table. This was something she only did when she was paying full attention. She'd been doing it since she was small, some unconscious signal that the world outside the pages had become more interesting than the world inside them. Victoria spoke again, this time a question, delivered with the directness of someone who doesn't pad their sentences, asking whether Daniel had reviewed the technical specifications her team had forwarded last week. It was a specific question with a specific purpose. She wanted to know his level of preparation, whether they were negotiating from a position of mutual technical understanding or whether she'd need to bridge a knowledge gap. The specs were detailed. His answer would tell her something important about who she was dealing with. Gregory translated. She's asking whether you've had time to look at the general framework document. These were not the same question, not even close. Had you reviewed the technical specifications, 14 words that assumed depth, preparation, specificity? Have you looked at the framework document, 8 words that assumed nothing, implied a casual glance, reduced the entire undertaking to a preliminary skim? Daniel answered the question he'd been given because that was all he could do, and his answer, translated back through Gregory to Victoria, became something slightly more hesitant than he'd said, slightly more uncertain, slightly more like a man who was here on hope rather than knowledge. The edges of his competence, as Gregory rendered them, were softer. The impression being constructed, across the table, was of a capable but somewhat out-of-depth individual who might be persuaded to accept terms less favorable than he deserved. Victoria's expression remained neutral, but her pen tapped once against the leather folder in front of her. Just once. Marcus, the associate, glanced at her. A monitoring glance, the look of someone checking a gauge. She didn't return the look. Emma came back to refill the water. She moved around the table's edge with the particular slowness of attentiveness, tilting the pitcher precisely, making no unnecessary movements. But her eyes tracked Gregory's notepad, the pen moving across it after each exchange. The small tick marks that appeared after the translations of significant content. She straightened. She set down the pitcher. She left. In the kitchen, she stood for a moment at the service station, her hand resting on the edge of the stainless steel counter, the cold of it grounding. Around her, the organized noise of a professional kitchen, the percussion of pans and the calling of orders, the heat from the line. She was in it and not in it. She'd spent 2 years in Shanghai between her junior and senior year at Columbia. She'd been studying comparative literature with a language component. and a professor had told her that the only way to understand a language was to live inside it for an extended period and stop treating it as a code to be cracked and start treating it as a way of thinking. She'd taken that seriously. She'd enrolled in a language institute in Jing'an, and she'd supported herself by waitressing at a hotel restaurant 3 nights a week, the kind of restaurant where the guests were international, and the staff moved between languages mid-sentence, and nobody thought anything of it. She'd gotten functional. She'd gotten comfortable with the music of it, the tonal structure, the way meaning shifted based on context and register. She wasn't fluent. She'd be the first to say so, but she understood enough to know what Victoria Hayes had actually said and what Gregory Marsh had actually relayed were different in ways that mattered. She'd caught it on the first exchange. She'd caught it again on the second. By the third, she was no longer unsure. She picked up her tray and walked back out. Daniel excused himself from the table, a quiet word about the restroom, and stepped away from the corner. He was crossing the open floor, halfway past a foretop of finance types, when Emma appeared at his side, moving in the same direction, her path natural, unremarkable, like someone heading toward the service corridor. She didn't look at him. "Your translator is lying." Her voice was barely a breath. Her face was forward. Daniel's stride didn't break. But something behind his eyes shifted, not surprise. Exactly. More like a lock clicking open. She continued past him without stopping. "He's reframing everything you say, making you sound uncertain." He changed her IP question entirely, and the buyout clause she described, he never mentioned it to you. She was gone before he reached the corridor entrance. Back to a table across the room, refilling a champagne flute with the practiced ease of someone who had said nothing at all. Daniel stood at the corner of the service hallway for 2 seconds. He thought about Lily, sitting at the table, her bird book face down. He thought about Gregory Marsh's hands, which were too still. He thought about Victoria Hayes, who had built a fund from nothing, and who would not survive 40 minutes of bad translation without noticing, which meant either she hadn't noticed, or she had and was waiting. He straightened his blazer. He walked back to the table. "Apologies," he said pleasantly. He sat down. He picked up his fork. "Should we continue?" Victoria studied him for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded to Gregory. Gregory began to speak, and Daniel listened very, very carefully to what was actually being said. There is a particular kind of patience that looks like passivity from the outside. Daniel had spent 4 years in Geneva working for an international arbitration body, the kind of institution that exists at the intersection of law, commerce, and diplomacy, where the outcomes of proceedings could affect supply chains and employment figures and the trajectory of industries. Before that, 18 months in Brussels negotiating trade framework language that would eventually become the basis for bilateral agreements. 2 years in Seoul before that, working on a semiconductor licensing dispute that had lasted longer than anyone expected and taught him more than anything else had about how people behave when significant money is in motion. He had negotiated in rooms where the wrong word in the wrong register could collapse a deal worth 9 figures. He had sat across from people who were lying to him. And he had learned slowly, expensively, through mistakes he still thought about occasionally at 2 in the morning, that the best response to being lied to is not to say so. Not immediately. First, you learn the shape of the lie. You learn its purpose, who does it serve, and how. You learn its reach. How far does it extend? And does it have limits? You learn its authorship. Is this someone operating alone? Or is this a direction that came from somewhere above? And you learn its architecture. Is this improvised, or is this practiced? Gregory was good. Daniel gave him that fully and without reservation. His tone never varied. His posture was correct. He had the practiced neutrality of a man who had done this many times and gotten away with it. And getting away with things repeatedly does something to a person. It makes them incrementally less careful, because the cost of carelessness has never arrived. But he had a tell. When he was modifying something significantly, not just adjusting for idiom, not just smoothing a register shift, but actually changing content, his pen moved. A small mark on his notepad, barely visible, almost entirely automatic. The physical tick of a man keeping 2 ledgers simultaneously and needing somewhere to mark which column he was currently working in. Daniel watched this for 6 minutes. He counted the modifications. 4 in 6 minutes. All in the same directional pattern, eroding Daniel's apparent expertise, softening his stated positions, widening the space between what he'd agreed to and what the other side would later claim he'd agreed to. It was consistent work. The kind of consistency that comes from a clear brief. Then Daniel began to play. He started giving Gregory information that contained internal markers details that were deliberately embedded with small technical errors, the kind of error that a non-expert might make, but that would be immediately recognizable to anyone with genuine knowledge of the software architecture. He described a specific aspect of the platform's data handling with a flaw he knew wasn't there. He said it clearly and waited. Gregory translated it faithfully, including the error. Didn't catch it, didn't flag it, which meant Gregory hadn't read the technical specifications himself. He wasn't operating from detailed knowledge of the deal's substance. He was operating from instructions directional, content-level instructions about what the overall outcome of the negotiation should look like, which meant his role was not to translate a conversation but to steer it, and someone had given him those instructions. The question was whether that someone was at this table. Victoria spoke. Gregory translated. Daniel answered. Gregory translated back. Lily had stopped pretending to read. She sat with her book closed in her lap, hands flat on the cover, watching her father with an expression that was quietly, absolutely focused. She had seen this before, not this room, not these stakes, not this version of her father in his working form, but the shape of it, the specific way his shoulders settled when he had moved from reception to analysis, the almost imperceptible change in his breathing rhythm. She understood it the way children understand things about their parents, not through words or explanation, but through years of close and devoted observation. She'd asked him once, when she was 7, and they were playing chess on the kitchen table, and she'd been losing for 40 minutes, why he was so quiet when he was thinking. He'd put down his knight and looked at her and said, "Because noise is how people hide. Quiet is how you find things." She thought about that now, watching Gregory's pen make its small marks. She thought about it, and she turned one more page of her closed book without looking down at it. Across the table, Marcus glanced at Gregory. It was a small glance, the kind calibrated to mean nothing to someone who wasn't looking for it. A checking in. A monitoring signal. Is it going as planned? Gregory gave no visible response. But Daniel saw it. He saw it, and he held it quietly in the part of his mind where he kept things that had not yet been used. The second course arrived. Emma set down the plates with her usual efficiency. In the half-second she spent near Daniel's chair, she didn't look at him, but her hand, setting down his plate, was slightly closer to his water glass than it needed to be. She was telling him she was still there. He gave no signal back. He didn't need to. Victoria had begun speaking more directly. Now she was pressing toward the structure of the agreement, clearly wanting to move to a close before the evening wound down. Gregory translated each statement. Each translation arrived slightly reshaped. The cumulative effect was a Daniel who had said yes to things he hadn't agreed to and remained uncertain about things he'd clearly affirmed. It was, Daniel thought, actually elegant work. Not crude. Not sloppy. The modifications were calibrated to erode his position without triggering any single alarm. If he'd been what he appeared to be, a mid-level tech professional, a single dad in a blazer, who'd lucked into owning a valuable IP license, he would have walked out of this restaurant, having signed something that effectively gave away 50 to 60% more value than he intended. And then he made his move. He waited for Gregory to finish a translation. Then he set down his fork. He looked at Victoria directly and said clearly, without inflection, in standard Mandarin, a single sentence. "I want to confirm I understood your buyout clause correctly. Year 3, at market rate, with a cap of 15% above acquisition price." The table stopped, not loudly. The sound in the room didn't change, but something in the air at that table became very, very still. Victoria's expression shifted, not dramatically, but the way a face shifts when it receives information, it didn't expect. A rearrangement. A moment of recalculation. Gregory's pen stopped moving. Lily looked up. Victoria said, in Mandarin, "You speak Mandarin." It wasn't a question. Daniel answered in English, pleasantly. "I understand it adequately. I prefer to work through translation for formal discussions. Less room for ambiguity on my end. But I like to check the key terms directly." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. Victoria looked at Gregory. Gregory looked at his notepad. "The buyout clause," Victoria said, now in English, her accent crisp and minimal, "was not described to you as I stated it." Another not a question. "No," Daniel said, "it wasn't." The restaurant continued around them, the low murmur of other conversations, the soft percussion of cutlery. The wine being poured 2 tables over. Inside the bubble of their corner table, something had fundamentally changed direction. Marcus put his tablet face down. "I'd like to go back," Daniel said, "to the beginning of this evening's discussion." His voice was calm. He might have been suggesting a different entree. Victoria nodded once. "Short. Decisive." Daniel looked at Gregory. "Would you like to begin, or shall I?" Gregory's hands were still on the table, but the stillness had changed quality. It was no longer performed. It was frozen. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Gregory said. "I'm suggesting," Daniel said, "that the discussion we had for the past 40 minutes bears only a passing resemblance to what Miss Hayes and I were actually saying to each other. I can go through it point by point if that's helpful." He didn't wait for Gregory to answer. He turned to Victoria. "Your first substantive statement was about the revenue structure. You described a split model 60-40 in the fund's favor with a buyout option at year 3 capped at 15% above acquisition value. What was relayed to me was an open-ended revenue discussion contingent on a full IP transfer at closing." Victoria's eyes had gone very still. "Your second statement was a direct question about whether I'd reviewed your technical specifications. What I was told was a general inquiry about the framework document." He paused. "These are not small differences." "No," Victoria said quietly. "They are not. The IP question matters most. What Gregory described would have required me to transfer all subsidiary rights, including some that have significant independent value, before any revenue agreement was finalized. What you actually proposed would preserve those rights until year 3. He met her eyes. "I would never have agreed to full transfer at closing, which I suspect is why I wasn't told that's what was being proposed." The silence at the table had a different texture now. It was the silence of people doing rapid calculation. Victoria turned to Gregory. When she spoke, it was in Mandarin, and her voice was exactly as level as it always was. "You modified the terms of my proposal." Gregory opened his mouth. "Don't," Victoria said. "One word." Gregory closed his mouth. "Did Marcus know?" She didn't look at her associate. Gregory said nothing. Marcus, to his credit, spoke. "I had concerns about the IP structure. I thought a more aggressive position at opening was worth exploring. I asked Gregory to frame things accordingly." The word frame sat in the air between them. Lily looked at Marcus. Then she looked at her father. Then she said her first words of the entire evening, quiet and without judgment. He was lying the whole time. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of observed fact, the way she might identify a bird from its wing beat. Marcus had the grace to look ashamed. Gregory did not. Emma, 2 tables away and not looking, heard Lily's voice and felt something loosen in her chest. Security, in restaurants like Aurelius, is never far away. Within 3 minutes of Victoria's quiet instruction to Marcus spoken in English, brief, unambiguous, a man in a dark suit appeared at the table's edge and waited. Gregory was asked to leave. He gathered his notepad. He stood. For a moment he looked at Daniel, and his expression had the particular flatness of someone who has been caught and is deciding how to carry it. Then he walked away through the restaurant with his pen still in his hand. And the maitre d' met him at the door. And that was the end of Gregory Marsh's involvement in the evening. The foretop nearby had gone quiet. 2 men in suits were watching without appearing to watch. A woman at the bar had stopped scrolling her phone. None of this was Daniel's problem. He sat at the table with his fork resting on the edge of his plate and his water glass. He was utterly, completely calm. This was the part that people always got wrong about him. They thought the calm was a performance, a mask, something he put on. It wasn't. It was just what happened when the situation clarified. When the noise resolved into signal, the tension in the room didn't reach him because he wasn't fighting it. He was simply watching it from a slight remove, the way you watch weather through a window. Lily had picked up her bird book again. She was reading, or seemed to be. Her hand was close to her father's arm on the table. Not touching. Just close. Victoria sat across from them and said nothing for a long moment. Marcus stared at his tablet. The associate was working through something, the implications, the liability, the question of what this meant for the deal and for his position within it. He modified the terms on your instruction, Daniel said to Marcus, without heat. That puts you in a complicated place. Marcus looked up. It was a strategy call. It was fraud. The word landed cleanly. Not dramatically. Daniel hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shifted in his chair. Just the word, placed in its correct position. Marcus looked away. Victoria's gaze had been on Daniel throughout this. She was a woman accustomed to reading situations and people. It was the core of what she did, the actual skill beneath the fund management and the capital deployment. She read rooms the way other people read spreadsheets. She was reading Daniel now. Mr. Whitfield, she said, after a moment. I owe you an apology. What happened tonight was not sanctioned. And I want to be direct with you. I didn't know. I believe you, Daniel said. She looked slightly surprised that he'd said it so quickly. You do? Yes. Because if you'd known and approved it, it would have been better designed. The errors in Gregory's translation were consistent but not sophisticated. He was following a rough script, not a precise one. That's not your work. He tilted his head slightly. It's sloppy. And you're not sloppy. Something moved in Victoria's expression that was almost a smile. No, she said. I'm not. The table was cleared. The restaurant had settled into the quieter register of late evening. A different waiter had taken over Emma's section while she stood near the service station, pretending to update an order on the handheld device, actually watching the corner table from across the room, with the careful attention of someone who has put something into motion and wants to know where it lands. Victoria had sent Marcus away a quiet instruction, economically worded, in English so Daniel could hear it. Marcus had gone, gathering his jacket and his tablet, with the careful posture of a man who understands that the next several days of his professional life will be uncomfortable. The door to the evening had closed behind him. The table was now 3 people, Victoria, Daniel, and Lily, who had finished her bird book and was now studying the ceiling with what appeared to be genuine architectural curiosity, her neck tilted back, her expression that of someone conducting a silent assessment. How long? Victoria asked. How long what? How long did you know? About the translation. Daniel considered the question with the same deliberateness he gave to everything. Not slow, not hesitant, but the deliberateness of a person who has decided that precision matters. I had a suspicion within the first 10 minutes. Something in the structure of what he was relaying, the grammar, was consistent, but the content kept sliding in a single direction. A translator working honestly will adjust register, adjust idiom, sometimes adjust emphasis for cultural reasons. What Gregory was doing was more purposeful than any of that. Every adjustment pointed the same way. Victoria nodded slowly. And you waited. I wanted to understand the shape of it before I responded to it. The why of it. You could have said something immediately. I could have. But then I would have known he was lying, and nothing else. If I waited, I could learn who was directing him, what the goal was, and how far they were willing to push before someone pulled back. He met her eyes. Marcus glanced at him once, partway through. After a particularly significant modification, it was brief, but it answered the authorship question. Victoria held his gaze. You are very good at this. I was, he said. Not falsely modest, just accurate. That's not what I mean. She leaned back very slightly, crossing her hands on the table with the precise composure of a woman who does not often allow herself to lean, I mean, you've been in this exact kind of situation before. Not just rooms with difficult people. This. The translation. The deliberate distortion. The patience. He said nothing. She decided to push, gently. She had a talent for applying exactly the right amount of pressure to exactly the right place. Your bio says logistics software. Former consultant. That's accurate. It's incomplete. Another pause. The couple at the nearby table had moved on to dessert. The candlelight in the restaurant had shifted as the ceiling lights dimmed slightly for the later hour. Aurelius had a programmable ambiance system that cost a figure not discussed in polite company. Lily had stopped examining the ceiling. She was watching her father in that particular way of hers, not to see what he'd say, but to see what he'd decide. She understood there was a difference. What people said was language. What they decided was character. I spent 8 years with the International Arbitration and Trade Mediation Group, Daniel said. Geneva, primarily, though the work required travel more often than I want to remember. I was a senior language analyst and negotiation specialist. My portfolio was primarily commercial and infrastructure disputes with significant cross-border complexity cases where the legal framework wasn't clear. The parties were operating in different regulatory contexts, and the only way through was to find what everyone actually needed beneath what everyone publicly claimed to want. Victoria said nothing. She was listening the way she listened to everything important completely, without the small signs of impatience that most people can't quite suppress. I worked extensively in Mandarin, Russian, and Portuguese, with functional capacity in German and French. My last major case was a 14-month dispute over infrastructure corridor rights between two state-owned entities. It was the most complex thing I'd worked on. He looked at his glass. It was also the last thing I worked on. You left. I left. His hand moved very slightly toward Lily, the automatic motion of a parent, below conscious thought, and stopped before it reached her. Not a completed gesture, just the impulse of it, visible for a second. My wife Caroline passed away 4 years ago. Lily was 6. I was in Kuala Lumpur when I got the call. I took the first flight back, and somewhere between Southeast Asia and New York, I decided that I was finished being in rooms I couldn't leave quickly when it mattered. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a person absorbing something that has reorganized the entire map of a conversation. Every data point from the evening now repositioning itself around this new center of gravity. The software, Victoria said finally, was developed by the firm I joined after Geneva. They needed someone who could navigate complex licensing negotiations and also articulate the product's technical value accurately. I'd always been interested in the engineering side language and logic share more than people expect. When the firm restructured 2 years ago, I negotiated my exit carefully, and the IP rights came with me as part of the settlement. He set down his glass. It's genuinely good software. It should be doing something useful in the world. It will be, Victoria said. The project it's intended for has real stakes, not fun performance stakes, actual infrastructure that affects how physical goods move through a region, where logistics inefficiency costs people real money and time at a very basic level. She let that sit for a moment. This is not a prestige acquisition. It's a functional one, I know. He had read every document she'd sent. All of it. That's partly why I'm here. And the other part? He glanced at Lily, who was now studying the copper light fixture directly above their table, with the focused attention of a naturalist examining a new species. Lily is expensive in all the best ways, he said. Lily looked down from the fixture. I'm extremely cost-effective, she said. I primarily require books, pencils, and natural light. And occasionally, a soufflé. As if on cue, the waiter arrived with a small, perfectly risen chocolate soufflé and set it in front of her with the reverence it deserved. Victoria watched Lily receive it with the particular gratitude of someone who has been told to expect 20 minutes and actually means it when she says she respects that kind of commitment. Then Victoria looked at Daniel, and something shifted in her expression, not the fund manager, not the negotiator, not the woman who had built something formidable by being relentlessly good at what she did, something else. Something from a layer beneath the professional identity that she kept, usually, quite carefully maintained. "Both of you made this evening considerably more interesting than it was supposed to be," she said. Lily looked up from her soufflé. "You said considerably. That's a formal word." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Is it? My teacher says people use formal words when they're being careful about something." "Are you being careful?" A beat. The kind of beat that means something is genuinely happening in the pause. Then Victoria Hayes, who had been called, in 4 separate financial publications, unflappable, and who had earned that description, laughed. It was short and genuine, and it surprised her slightly, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I am." Lily nodded, satisfied, and returned to her soufflé. Some things confirmed were simply that, confirmed. Emma came back to the table. Not to serve, her section had been covered. She came because Victoria had asked one of the other servers to send over the young woman who'd been working this corner earlier in the evening. Emma stood at the table's edge, holding her hands loosely in front of her, the way she'd been trained. Her expression was professional and gave nothing away. Victoria looked at her steadily. "You told him." "Not a question." Emma met her chaza. "I did. How much did you understand?" "Enough. I'm not fluent. But I studied in Shanghai for 2 years, and I worked in a restaurant there." "Some things are hard to misread even when you don't catch every word." Victoria nodded. There was something in her face. Not soft. Exactly. But unclenched. "Thank you." That took judgment. Emma glanced at Daniel. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind that's not performative. Just honest. "I've been a server for 3 years, Emma said. "You learn to read a room." She paused. "I almost didn't say anything. I wasn't sure it was my place." "It was your place," Daniel said quietly. "It's always your place to tell the truth." Emma looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Lily. "How are you doing?" "You've been very patient tonight." Lily considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "The ceiling in here has 3 different types of plaster work." "Did you know that?" Emma blinked. "I did not. The oldest section is in the far corner. You can tell because the pattern is less regular. That part was probably here before the restaurant." She tilted her head. "History is in weird places." Emma smiled, a real one, not a service smile. "Yeah, it really is." After Emma stepped away, Lily turned to her father. "I like her. You told her about the plaster. That means I like her." Daniel looked across the room to where Emma was moving between tables, refilling water, collecting plates, doing her job. She carried herself differently than she had at the start of the evening. Something had shifted in her posture, not pride, exactly. More like the quiet satisfaction of having done a thing that mattered. He understood that feeling. He hadn't felt it in a while. Victoria was reviewing something on her phone. She looked up. "The deal. Mr. Whitfield, I'd like to propose we start fresh, proper terms, properly conveyed, with no intermediary whose loyalty is unclear. I'd be open to that. I'll have my legal team draft a new framework. Clean." She set down her phone. "And I'll be direct with you. The terms I described tonight, the real ones, not Gregory's version, are genuinely what I'm offering. This isn't a second angle." "I know," he said. "How?" "Because if you were running a second angle, you would have had Marcus leave with Gregory. The fact that you sent Marcus away separately after the table was clear, means you're managing him internally, not protecting him." He tilted his head. "You're going to review what he did. Thoroughly." Victoria looked at him. "You're going to be very difficult to work with." "Probably. I'm going to enjoy it." The dessert menu came. Lily ordered the chocolate soufflé because the waiter told her it took 20 minutes, and she was impressed by that kind of commitment. The rain had stopped by the time they left Aurelius. The sidewalk outside was wet and bright, reflecting the streetlights in long orange streaks. The city moved around them, cabs, umbrellas being folded away, a delivery cyclist cutting through the crosswalk. New York, indifferent and energetic, and always in the middle of something. Daniel buttoned Lily's coat. "Dad, Mem. She liked you. He checked the second button. Miss Hayes was professional. That's not what I said. He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who has made a clear and accurate observation and is simply waiting for the adult in the room to catch up. He let it go. He took her hand. They started walking toward the parking garage on 53rd. 3 steps out, he stopped. Emma was just outside the staff exit around the corner, pulling on a jacket over her uniform. She was checking her phone. She looked up when she heard footsteps. Oh, she smiled slightly. Good night? Good end to a complicated night, he said. Yeah. She glanced at Lily. Did you see the plaster? Lily nodded seriously. I photographed it. She photographed it, Emma confirmed. An ambulance went by somewhere north of them. Its siren Doppler shifting as it moved away. The city absorbing it. As the city absorbs everything. I wanted to thank you, Daniel said. Emma shook her head. You did the actual work. You made a judgment call under uncertainty, and you got it right. That's not nothing. He paused. That's actually quite rare. She seemed to not quite know what to do with this. She looked down at her phone, then back up. The woman in there, Emma said. She built something real. The fund, the company. You can tell she's the kind of person who cares about whether things are actually right, not just whether they appear right. Yes, Daniel said. You can tell. You two would drive each other crazy. Daniel looked at her for a second. Then he smiled, a real one. Not the kind he'd worn at the table. Probably. Emma laughed. It was a good sound. I have to catch the uptown train. Good night, Lily. Good night, Emma. Lily looked at her seriously. The bird book has a section on urban species. Sparrows are underrated. Emma considered this. I'll remember that. She walked toward the subway entrance on 53rd. At the corner, she glanced back once. Then she was gone. Lily squeezed her father's hand. They walked. She was right, Lily said, after half a block. About what? About Miss Hayes. She looked at you like you were a problem she wanted to solve. That's not necessarily. It's a compliment, Lily said patiently. The best kind. She's not impressed by things that are easy. They reached the parking garage. The attendant recognized them and went to get the car. Lily stood at the barrier and watched the cars on the ramp below. Daniel stood beside her. He was thinking about Geneva, about the 14-month arbitration, about the moment a deal had finally closed at 2 a.m. in a glass conference room overlooking a lake, and how he'd driven home in a rental car and called his wife, and she'd been awake because she always waited up, and he'd said it's done, and she'd said good. Now come home, and that had been enough. That had been the whole world. He thought about Lily, 6 years old, standing in a doorway, not crying, just watching him pack a box. He thought about what you keep and what you lose and what you choose. Victoria Hayes had offered, as they'd wrapped up, a formal partnership structure, not just the IP license, but a consulting role. His expertise applied directly, the kind of work he used to do, for the kind of money that would make certain conversations about the future quieter and less frightening. He hadn't said yes. He hadn't said no. He'd said, "Let me think about what's right." She'd handed him her card. Then she'd looked at Lily and said, "You should know your father is very good at what he does." Lily had looked at Victoria Hayes with her level, bird-watching gaze and said, "I know. He's good at everything he does." And something had shifted in Victoria's face, there at the close of the evening, not professional, not calculated. Something that came from a place that doesn't show up on term sheets or quarterly reports. Something personal and a little surprised, like a window opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. The car came up the ramp. Daniel opened the door for Lily. She climbed in. He closed it gently. He stood for a moment in the orange-reflected glow of the garage, the city humming around him, the night cool after the rain. He thought, I'm not the same man I was in Geneva. He thought, that's not a loss. He thought, The quietest decision is sometimes the one that changes everything. He got in the car. Dad? Yeah. Are you going to call her? He started the engine. Miss Hayes? You know which one I mean. He pulled out of the garage and into the street. Let's get you home first, he said. Lily settled back in her seat, her bird book in her lap. The city moved past the windows. She watched it with her usual, patient attention. That's not a no, she observed. He drove. Around them, Manhattan kept doing what Manhattan does, building, breaking, beginning again. The rain was gone, and the streets were lit, and somewhere on the west side, a train was moving through dark tunnels toward morning, carrying people who had made decisions or failed to, who had been honest or hadn't, who had given things away or held them close. Daniel Whitfield drove his daughter home through a city that never stops asking what you're made of, and for the first time in a long time, he thought he might have an answer. Sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who hears everything, and sometimes what he hears most clearly is the sound of a life waiting to begin again.